Here we go. Welcome to Great Taste. I'm Steve Boss. Thank you for joining us. I am absolutely honored to have as our guest today, Dr. Robert H. Lustig, MD, MSL, the author of the new book, Metabolical, The Lure and the Lies of Processed Food, Nutrition, and Modern Medicine. Dr. Lustig practiced medicine for 40 years. He is Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco, where he specialized in neuroendocrinology and childhood obesity. In May 2009, he delivered a 90-minute lecture titled Sugar, the Bitter Truth for the University of California Television. It became popular on YouTube, and as of this month, April 2021, it has been viewed over 13 million times. The Financial Times called it Sugar's Tobacco Moment. Dr. Lustig, prior to beginning our discussion, I would just like to lay the groundwork. First, your book is extraordinary. I read it cover to cover.
Very kind of you.
Possibly explore all the important points you made or critical information you included during our time together. So let me just say, it's an in-your-face, much-needed reality check for anyone who lives on this planet. We'll try to tackle a few of the more important points you made in the book, including drugs can't and don't treat chronic disease. They only treat symptoms. The still perpetrated maxim that a calorie is a calorie. It's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food, which is your mantra. Protect the liver, feed the gut, which is another one of your mantras. And that real food is safe, simple, cheap, and green. And also try to cover the 3 immoral hazards. Quoting from the book's epilogue, here's what you wrote. In some ways, devising and planning this book was easy. I've been preparing for it for 45 years, and I've either learned or lived everything in it. In other ways, the actual writing of this book was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, because no matter what I say, I'm going to piss somebody off. Food is everyone's business, and so everyone has an opinion, informed or not. There's a lot of heresy in these pages, and in today's intuitive, antagonistic, and viral environments, I anticipate more heat than light from the blogosphere. The science had to be right in order to stand up to the onslaught of scrutiny and attempts to discredit that this book will no doubt engender from the medical establishment, scientific community, policy wonks, food industry, and of course, the general public. And I want to read that sentence again because it's really important. When you read this book, you'll understand. The science had to be right in order to stand up to the onslaught of scrutiny and attempts to discredit that this book will no doubt engender from the medical establishment, scientific community, policy wonks, food industry, and of course, the general public. To Dr. Lustig's conclusion, I'll add one other quote. He wrote, at UCSF, we have a motto. In God we trust, everyone else has to produce the data. So perhaps, Dr. Lustig, that's a good entry point because you state that the data you produced about nutrition does not match the party line. Sorry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. That is perhaps the best introduction I think I've ever received, and I want to thank you for it, because you just summed up the last 40 years of my life in one concept. I, for lack of a better word, have become an iconoclast. And it's not that I set out to be one. Some people set out to be one. I just ended up one because the science didn't match what was being propagandized by the general medical establishment and by the food industry and by the White House and by Congress and by the Surgeon General, by everybody else. And you go where the science takes you, at least real scientists do. And I am very careful never to overstep the science. There are 1,054 references in this book. And they're all to the primary literature or to historical, fact, in terms of either newspapers or reports, etc. So this book is what I would argue the best textbook of what's gone wrong in the last 50 years, not just with nutrition, but actually with all of modern medicine and really with all of society. And I hope people will look at it as sort of a historical benchmark. And maybe, if you understand that, then we can start turning it around. And that iconoclasm is, very much intended. So I appreciate your support.
I appreciate the book and the insights that it provided me, and I know it's going to provide literally, I hope, millions of people to actually improve not only their own lives, but society. And we'll get to that.
That's the plan.
Yeah. So let's talk about scientific research then, because I think it's critical that people understand the you know where I'm going.
I do.
Who's doing the research?
Right. So it all, what I've learned is that when you look at a journal article, the first thing you don't look at, but the first thing you should look at is the funding source. People look at the question, they look at the results, they look at the conclusion, they look at the authors, but really what they should be looking at is the funding source. And the question is whether or not the funder had a vested interest in the outcome of the study. Because it has now been shown that, especially for nutrition, if the food industry paid for the study, then the results are 7.36 times more likely to favor that food industry. That is not even remotely by chance. That is highly statistically significant. And you could make the argument, well, of course, that's why they're funding it. But the fact of the matter is, they're deep sixing the stuff that doesn't match what their industry supports. So you have to look at all of this with a very jaded eye. And I do. And that's part of the issue. An example, a meta-analysis that had been done by one of my, shall we say, I can't call him a colleague, I guess nemesis would be better, argued that there's inconclusive data that sugared beverages cause obesity and diabetes. And he used 60 data points that are in the literature to answer this question. And he said that the data is all over the place. Well, if you just do the meta-analysis the way he did it, that would be true. However, then my colleague at UCSF, Dr. Dean Schillinger, took that same article, took those same 60 data points, ran the same meta-analysis, except he added a variable, food company sponsorship, which was left out of the original article. And it turned out that of those 60 data points, 26 were funded by the food industry, 34 were not. And of the 26 that were funded by the food industry, all 26 said no effect of sugar on obesity and diabetes. And of the 34 that were independently funded, 33 of the 34 said, yes, very clear association between sugar consumption and obesity and diabetes. So what that means is that the food industry has polluted the data. And they've polluted it on purpose so that then they can run a meta-analysis and say, see, it's inconclusive. So not only are the data suspect, but the motives are very clear and apparent.
Mm-hmm. And I think that many of us have lived through this type of, well, more than one type, and you mentioned several of them in the book, of, we'll call it cover-up. And the one that stands out more than any is nicotine and the tobacco industry. And
Sure.
What we've seen is that over time, not only will the truth come out, unfortunately over time, but society can change. And I think that's definitely something that I want everyone to understand, because if you just read your book and don't realize that change is possible, it can be pretty daunting.
That's exactly right. And I totally agree with you. Change does happen. And I specifically state in the book, let's look at the last 30 years. There have been four, count them, four cultural tectonic shifts in the United States in the last 30 years. And here they are. Number one, bicycle helmets and seatbelts. Number two, drunk driving. Number three, Smoking in public places. Number 4, condoms in bathrooms.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, 30 years ago, if a legislator had stood up in a state house or in Congress or parliament or anywhere and had suggested legislation against any one of these 4, they had gotten laughed right out of town. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my friggin' car. Okay, that's the way it would have been. Today, they're all facts of life. We live with all of them. No one's complaining about any of those. And if you pull out of your driveway and your seatbelt is not buckled, your kids will scream at you. So what happened? How'd that happen? And why did it take 30 years? The reason, number 1, we taught the children. The children grew up and voted. And the naysayers are dead. That's why it's a generational shift. That's why it takes 30 years. It doesn't just happen overnight. None of these things just you snap your finger and all of a sudden it all changes. Okay. That's not the way society works. That's not the way, society progresses. It progresses slowly. The point is it progresses, but it only progresses if you take the first step. That old, saying, the longest journey still starts with a single step. You got to start somewhere. And I would argue that with food, we're about 7 to 8 years into this 30-year journey. Okay, we're certainly not at the beginning. Okay, we're way past the beginning, but we are not even remotely close to the end. This is going to take a long time. The problem is that for all of the others, those other 4 things I just mentioned, there was no time clock. But now there is. And the reason is because food is one of the things that's poisoning the climate. And we've been told, if we believe it, and I believe it, that we only have like 10 years left to be able to turn the climate thing around before irreversible damage is done to the entire planet. We're already seeing the signs of it, and islands are going to disappear because of the increase in sea level. So we are right in the middle of it, and we have to do something about it. And food is part of that. It's not the only thing. Obviously, transportation, the whole green energy thing is part of that. But food is definitely a part of this issue. And the question is, like, what are we going to do? And that's what this book addresses. And ultimately, what I'm arguing in the book is that processed food is the reason that food contributes to climate problems. And if we ate real food instead of processed food, these problems would actually not only stop, but they would get better.
And by the way, I thought there were some very interesting solutions that you suggested. I hope we'll even be able to get to that part of this discussion. But I think before we get there, we better go back to the whole idea of what is the landscape that people are facing, not only on their plates, but also when they're dealing with their own personal health.
Right. So ultimately, people always say food is health. They don't understand what they mean. They don't even get it. Good food is health. Bad food is poison. And people say, well, wait, it's food. But actually, processed food is not food. And that's the point I'm trying to make in the book. Just because they call it processed food doesn't actually make it food. They say, well, but it's got nutrients. Well, yeah, but nutrients can kill you too, depending on what they are and when they're administered and how much. Ultimately, the point I try to make in the book, and I hope I make it, effectively, is that it's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food that matters. All food is inherently good. It's what we do to the food that's not. And there are 2 particular things that have been done to the food that make them poison, that make ultra-processed food poison. and they are related to this protect the liver, feed the gut mantra. And I show scientifically in the book why those are the two things that matter. You know, Michael Pollan said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's 7 words, 3 clauses, and they're all wrong. This is 6 words, 2 clauses, and they're both right scientifically. Protect the liver, feed the gut. So what are we protecting the liver from? We're protecting it from the onslaught of many things, but mostly sugar, mono and disaccharides primarily, because that's what's been added to processed food for palatability, also for addiction. Problem is, our livers can't process, can't handle, can't metabolize all of that excess refined carbohydrate and sugar. And so what happens is the liver has no choice but to take the excess and turn it into liver fat. And it is that liver fat that drives the chronic metabolic diseases we see today. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. And that is 75% of all healthcare costs today. That group, they are all chronic metabolic diseases because your liver can't process the energy effectively. And I explain why in the book. To explain it now would be too difficult without diagrams and what have you. So protect the liver. Mm-hmm. And the second clause is feed the gut. So what are you feeding the gut? So first of all, you know, people now have heard of the intestinal microbiome. Mm-hmm. You know, this is a relatively new concept, but it's out there. People are now talking about gut health. They're talking about probiotics, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. You know, if you eat a yogurt, that's got active cultures in it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that sounds really good, right? Why do you have to keep eating the yogurt? Why don't the bacteria that are in the yogurt take? Why don't they, you know, why you should only have to eat something once, and then those bacteria should flourish in your intestine, and you should be able to solve all of your metabolic health problems just like that. Why does it work? And the reason is because that's why the bacteria died off in the first place, is because the environment that those bacteria find themselves in is so inhospitable that they don't have the capability of growing. And that's because of what we eat. So we have to change the intestinal environment to make it a hospitable place for those bacteria to be able to take and grow. The way to do that is not probiotics. The way to do that is prebiotics. That is changing the intestinal environment to allow for the good bacteria to be able to grow and help you in terms of health. Well, what's a prebiotic? One word: fiber. Well, the fiber has been taken out of all the food by the food industry on purpose because you can't freeze fiber. Fiber is what makes food go rancid. And because of that, so like for instance, whole grain bread, okay? Whole grain bread. So here's a grain right here. You're looking at it, it's a sphere, right? And in the center of this is the starch, the endosperm, okay? But the husk is the fiber surrounding the endosperm. And then there's also this little thing on the inside here called the germ. And that's where all the good stuff is. That's the goodie bag in that kernel. It's got the polyphenols, the flavonoids, the vitamins, the biotin, all, you know, virtually everything that you need to be healthy is in that germ, the wheat germ, if you will. Well, when you process that grain and you crush it, you pulverize it, now that germ is exposed to the elements. It wasn't before, but it is now. And all of those active compounds that I just mentioned, all the healthy stuff, they react with oxygen and they go rancid. And the bacteria eat them and they go rancid. They become lipid peroxidated. They go rancid and they taste like crap. Well, food industry knows that. Okay, so what do? They take a whole grain, they pulverize it. Okay, they take the germ out, and because they take the germ out, all of a sudden it's not whole grain anymore. In addition, the husk, the kernel, was actually protective because the starch on the inside, okay, you want that to be absorbed slowly, because the slower it gets absorbed, the lower the glucose excursion in your blood, therefore the lower the insulin response. Therefore, the less effect the insulin is going to have on the chronic metabolic diseases of your body, because insulin drives these diseases. And also, the lower the glycemic excursion, okay, the less likely you are to have to put out more insulin and no type 2 diabetes. So you want that kernel intact so that the starch gets absorbed slowly. But as soon as you pulverize it, horse is out of the barn. Now it gets absorbed rapidly, goes straight to your portal veins, straight, to your liver, overwhelms your liver, generates a high glycemic excursion in your bloodstream. Now you have a big insulin response, and now you got a disaster. So that fiber is protecting your liver because it's coating the starch that you're trying to limit the effect of. And also that fiber is feeding your gut because the gut bacteria use the fiber as their food for its own purposes. So when you eat fiber, you're not eating for you, you're eating for your 100 trillion bacteria. And if you don't feed your bacteria, they feed on you. They will eat the mucin layer right off your intestinal epithelial cells. And when that happens and you lose that barrier, now the bacteria are right opposed to your intestinal epithelial cells. And that is what drives irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, leaky gut, this concept that things that are supposed to stay inside your intestinal lumen get out into the bloodstream. And that generates inflammation, insulin resistance, and chronic metabolic disease too. So keeping your intestinal barrier fortified and safe is essential. And the way to do that is by feeding the bacteria what they need, which is the fiber. But we take the fiber out of the food. So protect the liver, feed the gut, reduce the sugar, make sure there's plenty of fiber. Well, you need a low sugar, high fiber diet. That's called real food. The problem is that's not what we have. What we have is a high sugar, low fiber diet. That's called processed food. So real food, health. Processed food, poison.
So for the average consumer, they go to the grocery store and they see all of these foods that say whole grains.
Right. Maybe it
But
is,
in reality,
maybe it isn't.
Right.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. They're allowed to say whole grain if they started with whole grain. And that's not right. They should only be able to say whole grain if it's still whole grain. But the FDA does not have a definition of whole grain. And the food industry takes advantage of this, and the FDA, just basically sits on its thumbs.
So for the average person, when you say fiber, what is it that they should be looking for to be putting into their gut?
Right. So this is a very, very important, consideration, is how can people protect themselves? So for fiber, unfortunately, it's a little hard. For sugar, it's a little easier because now there's information on the label that will help you. Bottom line is, real food doesn't need a label. All right. There's no label on a broccoli. There's no label on a radish. There's no label even on an apple. Okay. Because they don't need one. Okay. There's only a label if something's been done to the food. So a label automatically means in some fashion it's been processed. So every label should be viewed by the public as a warning label. And my point in the book, the argument I make is that it's not what's on the label that matters, because what's been done to the food is more important than what's in the food. And the label only reflects what's in the food, not what's been done to the food. So the information you really need isn't even on the label. That's the problem. So how can you glean the information that you need off that label? And that's what the book, tries to explain. So for fiber, it's a little math, sadly. And basically what you need to do is you need to look at the total carbohydrate, which is listed, and you need to look at the dietary fiber, which is listed. Now, the problem with that is it could have been added fiber. It could, and if it's added, it's only soluble, not insoluble. And what you should be looking at is a ratio of total carbohydrate to dietary fiber that is less than 10:1. So you have to do a little math. Preferably, it should really be a 5:1 ratio. So what you need to know is that if you take a kernel, wheat kernel, wheat berry, or whatever, okay, and you strip off the fiber and you just end up with the starch, you have lost 30% of the weight of that kernel. 30% of the weight of the kernel was the fiber. So if it's got a high carbohydrate and a low fiber, you know that that has been ultra processed. And the closer the total carbohydrate is to that dietary fiber, the less it's been processed. So that's unfortunately the only way you can figure it out now. I'm hoping that in the future we'll have better answers for this.
All right. So you talked a little bit about protecting the liver and the need for fiber and the feed the gut part then.
Yep. So the intestine, okay, has all these bacteria in it, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. Now, unfortunately, the bad bacteria seem to grow no matter what. The good bacteria seem to need help to grow. Maybe that's why they're good, but they need support. And, the good bacteria tend to be lactobacilli and bifidobacteria and Bacteroides. The bad guys tend to be Akkermansia and there's a whole host of, bad guys. Oh, and the Clostridia, they're really bad. The point is that they are not equivalent, and you have to basically bolster your good bacteria. And the way you do it is with dietary fiber. And people don't know that. And people don't understand that. We know that these other bacteria are causing problems. In addition, we know that the good bacteria are being killed off in our intestine by antibiotics. Now, maybe you took some antibiotics, like for an ear infection, or maybe you didn't take some antibiotics, but you did. You just didn't know it, because the antibiotics have been given to the animals. They've been given to the cows. They've been given to the chickens. And the reason is because those cows and chickens are sick, because they're being raised on a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation. They are being fed corn, which is relatively low in all of those micronutrients, the flavonoids, the polyphenols, et cetera. So they are malnourished, but they are overnourished because they get plenty of energy from the corn. But they don't actually have good enough immune systems to be able to fight off all the diseases, especially when they're pent up all close to each other. People who live in tenement houses are much more likely to get typhus and tuberculosis and all sorts of infectious diseases, which is why we don't have tenement houses anymore. We learned that in the early 1900s. But, basically, you should look at a CAFO as a tenement house for an animal. So they're getting sick, sitting in their own excrement, and they don't have the immune capacity to fight off those infections. So they get plied with antibiotics in order to be able to keep growing and keep gaining weight. And then, of course, they get slaughtered and, they end up in our supermarkets. Well, guess what? That meat, that poultry, that fish, they still got antibiotics in them. And so we consume them not knowing that they've been, treated with this. And so what happens to our gut bacteria? They die off. And then the bad guys who, tend to be more resistant to those, they get to overpopulate. And now you've got irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, et cetera, and risk for autoimmune disease. So all of these things happen because not because of what's in the food, but rather what's been done to the food. Is there any food that's labeled and says antibiotics here? Not on there. So this is why it matters. This is why real food fixes the problem, whereas processed food makes the problem.
So fiber is actually the key, one of the keys for protecting the liver and feeding the gut, because it does both.
It does both.
But then there are other substances, I think you call them hedonic substances.
Right.
And those substances are deleterious to both.
Well, they're designed to make you eat more. I mean, that's what hedonic means, basically pleasure, we're activating the reward center. Anything that activates the reward center in the brain, called the nucleus accumbens, is hedonic. So let's name some hedonic substances. Cocaine, used to be in food, right? Called Coca-Cola. Amphetamine, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, right? Sugar is a hedonic substance. It activates the nucleus accumbens. And any item, anything that activates the nucleus accumbens in the extreme leads to addiction. So cocaine, that's easy. Heroin, that's easy. Nicotine, that's easy. Alcohol. Does alcohol lead to addiction? Answer, in 20%. Now, what makes the difference between somebody who can be a social drinker, lift up a can of beer and put it back down, versus a guy or woman who has a major league alcohol problem? We don't know the answer to that yet. We're still trying to figure that out. But, 40% of America are teetotalers, 40% are social drinkers, and 20% have an alcohol problem, and 10% are hardcore alcoholics. Sugar is probably the same thing. So there are plenty of people who can have something sweet and say, okay, I'm done. But there are plenty of people who have a major, major problem with sugar. And there are plenty of people out there who say, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth. Well, that's sugar addiction. It's just that it's socially acceptable, so they don't mind saying it. Would they just as easily say, well, I have a real alcohol problem? That's something that's to be shamed, and our society looks down on. All right. But, if you have a sweet tooth, hey, let's go have another chocolate bar together. That's a different thing because it's socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the issue. Sugar is addictive, not in everyone, but in enough people. And the stimulation of the dopamine in the reward center drives further consumption. And so that the food industry's figured it out. The more they add, the more you buy. And we know this because there's an economic phenomenon that economists track. It's called price elasticity. So what price elasticity is if you raise the price of a food by 1%, then consumption should go down by a certain amount, because you've basically made it effectively harder to get because you've raised the price. You've reduced effective availability. So there should be a reduction in consumption when you raise the price. Well, if you have complete reduction, if it goes to zero, okay, then you're price elastic. It's responding to the change in price. If it doesn't change consumption, then it's price inelastic. It's not responding to the change in price, which means it's hedonic because it doesn't matter what it costs, you still need it. And what are the three most price inelastic foodstuffs? What are the most price what are the most hedonic foodstuffs? Fast food, soft drinks, juice, all the high sugar ones. The lowest food for price elasticity, for price inelasticity, is eggs. So when the price of eggs go up, people stop eating eggs. So there's nothing in an egg that's hedonic. Plenty of stuff that's good for you, but nothing that's hedonic. So all the stuff that we eat is because the food industry gamed it to be so. And it's killing us.
This is Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss. We are talking with Dr. Robert Lustig, the author of the new book, The Lure and the Lies of Processed Food, Nutrition, and Modern Medicine. So can you give us a little bit of insight, though, as to, are there any differences between processed food with added sugar and the consumption of, say, for example, an apple that certainly has a lot of sugar, a date that has a lot of sugar, that type of.
Sure. So apples are good. Apple juice is not. But they're the same, aren't they? No, they're not. Why are they not? So my colleague and cookbook co-author, Cindy Gershon, who was an educator in the Mount Diablo Unified School District here in the Bay Area, she runs her nutrition class every year, and she always starts the class with the exact same experiment every single year. She takes 2 kids from the class, neither of whom have had breakfast, because this is a low socioeconomic status, school, Title I school. And she hands each kid 6 oranges. And she says to the first kid, "Okay, kid, here's 6 oranges. Make juice." Kid squeezes the 6 oranges, 12.5-ounce glass, downs the whole thing, says, "Okay, so what's for breakfast?" Second kid, she says, "Here, kid, here's 6 oranges. Eat the 6 oranges." Kid eats orange number 1, orange number 2, orange number 3, gets to orange number 4 and throws up. She's got the vomit basin ready because she knows what's going to happen and she knows when. And the kid goes, "Oh my God, I'm going to die." And then the kid doesn't eat lunch or dinner. What happened? The fiber happened. So the fiber has 6 benefits in the gut, 6 separate benefits. First, the soluble and insoluble fiber, and you need both. So soluble fiber is like pectins, like what holds jelly together. Insoluble fiber is cellulose, the stringy stuff in celery. Okay, and of course, oranges have both. The 2 together form a gel on the inside of the duodenum, on the inside of the intestine after the stomach. I liken it to a spaghetti colander. Okay, so metal bowl with holes in it, right? You run the water, goes right through. Now, take a blob of petroleum jelly, throw it into the center, Vaseline right in the center. Okay, run the water, still runs through, bounces off the jelly, but runs through. Now take your finger and rub it all the way around the inside of that colander. Now run the water. Now you got a barrier. Now the water doesn't run through. So imagine that the soluble fiber, the pectins and all, are globular. They're plugging the holes in that colander. Imagine the insoluble fiber, the cellulose, is setting up a lattice work like a fish net. Okay, and the holes are being plugged together. They form this impenetrable secondary barrier, this gel, and you can see it on electron microscopy. And what that's doing is that is keeping mono and disaccharides, sugars, from being absorbed early on in the duodenum so that they don't reach the liver, thus protect the liver. So you're protecting the liver. That's number 1. Number 2, if you're protecting the liver, that means you're also not getting all that glucose and fructose into the portal system, which means that you're not getting the biggest glycemic excursion. So you're keeping your insulin response down. And keeping your insulin response down means, number one, the insulin's not driving chronic disease, and also the insulin is not driving cells to proliferate, so you're not getting risk for heart disease or cancer. All good. All right, so that's a second benefit. Third benefit, the food goes through the intestine faster because the fiber basically greases the skids, as it were. And so you end up moving things down to the ileum, the last part of the intestine, and that's where the satiety signal is. So the peptide YY signal, which goes to your brain and says, I'm done, I'm finished, I'm satiated, I am completely done. And so by getting that signal sooner, you won't eat the second portion, kind of like Cindy's experiment, right? Number 4, okay, those bacteria get fed with the extra mono and disaccharides that you didn't absorb, so they go further down the intestine and feed those bacteria. So you're feeding the gut. Okay, number 5. The soluble fiber gets turned by the colonic bacteria into short-chain fatty acids, butyrate and propionate, which are immune suppressive, which is good, like preventing the cytokine response of COVID, and also insulin suppressive. And so they keep your insulin response down, which is good. And number 6, the fiber, especially the insoluble fiber, acts like little scrubbies on the inside of your colon to try to dislodge potential cancer cells. So people who eat high fiber have a much lower risk of cancer. So there are 6, count them, 6 separate ways that your soluble plus insoluble fiber that you find in real food will help you with chronic metabolic disease. The problem is our food doesn't have any fiber in it because it's been removed by the industry, because you can't freeze it.
So what if I don't drink juice, but I make a smoothie by taking the whole apple or the whole orange or the whole date and I pulverize it?
Right.
Am I getting what I need or not?
So the insoluble fiber, that cellulose, that stringy stuff, if you will, okay, all gets sheared to smithereens by the blades. So it can't set up that gel. That fish net is basically so chopped up that it can't hold any fish. All right. And so it can't set up and make that gel that coats the inside of the intestine. So you're still going to flood your liver. You're still going to get that glycemic excursion. You're still going to get that insulin response. Now, will the soluble fiber, which is still intact, will it have benefits? Yes. You'll still move it through the intestine faster, so you'll still get the satiety signal sooner. That's good. You'll still get the short chain fatty acids out of it, but you won't get the scrubby effect, and you won't be able to feed the gut the same way because the mono and disaccharides got absorbed early. So of the 6 things that I just mentioned that fiber is good for, you're going to have lost 4 of them. So is it better than not? Yeah. But is it good? No. So basically, the way to think of it is you got an apple, you got an applesauce, and you got apple juice. Okay, the apple's good. The apple juice is bad. What's the apple sauce? Is it more like the apple or is it more like the apple juice? Turns out it's more like the apple juice.
Okay. So now, many people are listening, watching, and one of the things that's going through their mind, well, you have to get a certain number of calories every day.
No, you don't.
That's like, right. That's where I want to go now. So that mantra, or that maxim that people have, that a calorie is a calorie, which you're saying, have said for a long time, is not anything new. Right. That's absolutely false.
It's completely false. And I'll give you several reasons why it's false. The American Dietetic Association wants it to be true. And it's been true for them since 1916, since Wilbur Atwater developed the Atwater Index, which the dietitians use. And Atwater is the one who said, yeah, if you take a fat and you burn it in a bomb calorimeter, it gives you 9 calories per gram. And if you take a protein and you burn it, it gives you 4 calories per gram. And if you take a carbohydrate and you burn it, it gives you 4 calories per gram. So we should be able to mix and match based on numbers of calories so that, fat's bad because it's the highest energy density, and carbohydrate and protein are better because they are lower energy density, because a calorie is a calorie. And they're fungible. Calories are fungible. Doesn't matter where the calorie comes from. That's the dietitian's screed. That's their mantra. And it is total, complete BS. It is absolutely false. All right. So how do I know it's false? Right? Give me some data, Dr. Lustig. All right. I'll give you four reasons. You like almonds?
Yes.
I love almonds. Almonds are great. Okay. You eat 160 calories in almonds, half a cup, 160 calories in almonds. How many of those calories do you absorb? 130.
Okay.
What happened to the other 30? You ate them. Where'd they go? So you ask people, they say, oh, they must have gone out in the stool. No, they didn't go out in the stool. Where'd they go? The microbiome ate them. The reason is because you didn't absorb them early, because the fiber in the almonds set up that gel, so you didn't get it early. And so the bacteria chewed it up. Remember, 30% of what you eat isn't for you. It's for your bacteria.
Right.
So just because it passed your lips doesn't mean you got it.
Mm-hmm.
So if the calorie came with fiber, that calorie wasn't for you, it was for your bacteria. It doesn't count. Right? So a calorie is not a calorie, because a calorie that comes with fiber is taken off the ledger. So that's 1. 2, protein. Now, proteins obviously get turned into amino acids, and amino acids then get built into other proteins like muscle in your body, and all good, okay. But if a protein is burned for energy, which happens, it's unavoidable, turns out you have to take the amino group off the amino acid. And then you get an organic acid. And then that organic acid can enter the Krebs cycle for burning. The process of taking that amino group off the amino acid costs energy. So preparing an amino acid for burning has an energy deficit associated with it that carbohydrate does not. So you get fewer calories out, even though the number you burned in the bomb calorimeter was the same, but you get fewer calories out. So a calorie is not a calorie because they're not fungible, because they're not the same. They ought to be the same, but they're not. So that's protein. Fat. So over here on this side, we have omega-3s. Heart healthy, save your life. Single best thing you can put in your body, bar none. Omega-3s. Over here, you got trans fats, the devil incarnate. Okay. Consumable poison. Okay. Single worst thing you can do for yourself. So bad that the FDA actually took it off the generally recognized as safe list. Finally. Only took them 25 years. All right. They're both 9 calories per gram. One will save your life, one will kill you. How come? Because a calorie is not a calorie. Depends on what that calorie is.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, number 4, fructose and glucose. So glucose is the energy of life. Every single cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so goddamn important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. A process called gluconeogenesis. Fructose, on the other hand, the sweet molecule in sugar, is irrelevant. It's vestigial. There's no biochemical reaction in the body that requires it. It is completely unnecessary for life. Right? And we love it. It's addictive, but it actually poisons our mitochondria. And this was work that Ron Kahn's lab at Joslin demonstrated. It actually poisons the mitochondria's ability to oxidize fats. So they're both 4 calories per gram, but one you can burn and the other one stops you from burning. So a calorie is not a calorie because it matters what it is. So the quality of the food matters more than the quantity of the food. So my job is to kill the calorie. The calorie must get the silver stake through the heart. And that is why I wrote this book. And the problem is any dietitian who believes in calories is part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Mhm.
And it's very easy to tell the dietitians apart. And in the book, I tell you how. It's very simple. You ask them one question. Do you need sugar to live? And if they say yes, they need to have their licenses revoked.
So in the book, you give people 4 basic pieces of information to try to navigate this minefield if they have an issue, or even if they don't, but they have to go to a health professional.
Well, they can gather some data themselves on their own without the health professional, but they do need some information in their labs in order to be able to diagnose themselves. And chapter 9 basically tells people what they can do to figure out whether they're sick and what to do about it. So there is some self-help involved in this.
Yes. And there's also, though, some really important points, I think. Don't take busy for an answer. Don't take normal for an answer. Don't take paternalism for an answer. Get the numbers.
Right. So everyone always tells me, yeah, my doctor told me my labs were normal. Garbage. I don't know what normal means. Normal means nothing. Okay. If you take normal, basically you've allowed your doctor to be paternalistic to you. And that is not helpful. Now, I understand that you may not know how to read those numbers. And that's why your doctor shorthanded, this concept of normal for you. But that's what the book is for, is basically to tell you what those numbers really do mean and how you can interpret them, because it's likely your doctor is not. Perfect example of this is a particular lab test, which everyone gets on their chem panel. It's called ALT, alanine aminotransferase. This is a liver function test, and it tells you whether you've got fatty liver or not. It's very sensitive. It's not specific. There are other things that make your ALT go up as well. But if you've got fatty liver, your ALT goes up. That's what you need to know. So you need to know your ALT. Here's the problem. On the lab slip, the first column says, the lab ALT. The second column, gives the result. And the third column has either an H or an L, high, low. That H or L is $10. That's an interpretation. The lab gets to charge for that. It's complete and utter bullshit. But that's why it's there. So everybody just looks at the H and the L and says, okay, that's it. So it has to do with what the reference range is. So the reference range for ALT is up to 40. Now, it turns out when I went to medical school in 1976, so 45 years ago now, the upper limit for ALT was 25. Today, it's 40. How come? Same test. What's going on? How come it was 25 then and 40 now? Answer, because everyone's got fatty liver and they don't know it. Because the 45% of Americans have fatty liver right now, this minute, and they don't know it. And so they go to the doctor, they think they're healthy, they get their labs drawn, and you get the Gaussian distribution, and you cut it off at 2 standard deviations above the mean, and that is at 40. Because everyone's got fatty liver. The whole curve has been shifted to the right over the last 50 years. But if your doctor doesn't know that, 25 is still the upper limit of normal. So you got to know your labs and you got to know how to read them, and your doctor doesn't. So that's why the book is necessary, is to give people the information they need to diagnose themselves.
As I said right at the beginning, we're never going to get anywhere near into all of the incredible information that's part of this book. So before we have to end this discussion, I'd like you to give people some hope that there's steps that can happen for change. And you write in the book that change has to be easy and sustainable, and that education is not the answer.
Right.
It's only one part of the answer.
Education is necessary, but not sufficient. Education has not solved any substance abuse. Did Nancy Reagan's just say no work? We've got an opioid crisis. It's not like we didn't know that opioids were a problem. We've got an opioid crisis. So education alone cannot solve this problem. But what education does do is it softens the playing field, okay, and allows everyone to play on it. And then people will understand why certain regulations, and I know that's a bad word nowadays, but fact is we need regulations, and we're glad for regulations when they work. Okay, I mean, your food is safe because of regulations, right? I mean, it's not filled with salmonella because of regulations, right? Well, the fact is, the food industry has to be held to a higher standard, and they're fighting this tooth and nail because they don't want a higher standard. Okay, because this is their juggernaut. Adding sugar to food is what brought their annual profit margin from 1% per year to 5% per year. Okay, you think they want that, run backwards? Okay, forget it. They're on the other side. But the point is that the public can put enough pressure on the politicians to be able to reel them in. And that can only be accomplished through individual education first. And that is what I'm trying to do in this book. I'm trying to elevate the need for understanding food to a top level societal problem. I mean, we've got lots of them, okay? And if you didn't think so, COVID revealed all of them. Okay, and all you have to do is turn on the TV every day and find out what our societal problems are. And there are a lot of them. Okay, but food impacts every single one of those. So food has to come up to the top, and people have to demand better of their food. And when they do, then things will change, and not one moment sooner.
Metabolical is the name of the book. The Lure and the Lies of Processed Food, Nutrition, and Modern Medicine. Dr. Robert Lustig has been my guest. All I can say is thank you for your book. Thank you for your commitment to making us a more aware and healthier society. And my hope is that there will be millions and millions of people who will read this book and find it not only helpful, but it will be one of the elements to make permanent and lasting change. And that would be fantastic.
From your mouth to God's ears, Steve.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss, and I usually end with 3 words, which is eat for joy. But now, this particular episode, I have to also end with Dr. Lustig's words. Now, not only eat for joy in terms of great taste, but protect the liver and feed the gut.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Biochemistry. And so I learned all this stuff back in 1975. And then I went to medical school, and they beat it out of me. And I practiced for the first 20 years of my career, basically the way they taught me to. And no one was getting better.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why, so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, it hasn't, and I think you make a point that it really hasn't changed that much, right, in terms of the actual academics and what's taught.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's why I'm actually hoping that the book will become a textbook in medical school.
Yeah, yeah.
I would never say this on, public if you were running the thing.
Hold on.
No, you can't.
I'll make sure that the recording's off.
No. Yeah, make sure the recording's